The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything James Mitchell thought he knew about fate, loss, and second chances. As a paramedic with 8 years of experience responding to Austin's most critical emergencies, he'd seen countless situations that tested the boundaries between life and death. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he would roll up his patient's sleeve to start an IV and discover a tattoo that would shake him to his very core. A delicate hummingbird with the exact same distinctive wing pattern that his deceased wife Sarah had inked on her shoulder just months before the cancer took her away. The woman lying unconscious on his stretcher wasn't just another emergency call. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She was Emma Rodriguez, and the tattoo on her arm would reveal a connection so profound that it would force James to confront everything he thought he understood about destiny, family, and the mysterious ways that love finds its way back into broken hearts. James Mitchell had always believed that life came down to split-second decisions made in the back of an ambulance racing through Austin's neon-lit streets. At 34, he'd spent the better part of a decade as a paramedic, responding to emergencies that ranged from minor fender-benders to life-threatening trauma cases that would haunt most people's dreams for years. His hands had learned to stay steady when adrenaline flooded his system, his voice remained calm when chaos erupted around him, and his mind could process medical protocols, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. Tonight felt different from the moment his radio crackled to life with dispatch coordinates for a downtown apartment complex. His partner Marcus Rodriguez had been unusually quiet during their shift, nursing his third cup of gas station coffee while staring out at the Austin skyline that stretched beyond the ambulance windshield. The summer heat still radiated from concrete and asphalt even though midnight was approaching, creating that particular Texas atmosphere where the air itself seemed to pulse with restless energy. The emergency call was classified as a possible overdose, which meant they could expect anything from a false alarm triggered by concerned roommates to a genuine life-threatening situation requiring immediate intervention. James had responded to hundreds of similar calls throughout his career, each one carrying its own unique combination of human drama and medical urgency that reminded him why he'd chosen this profession in the first place. As they pulled up to the 3-story brick building on East 6th Street, James noticed the crowd of residents gathered in the parking lot, their faces illuminated by the red and blue lights that Marcus had activated during their approach. A young man in his 20s was pacing frantically near the building's entrance, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the second floor where a window remained lit despite the late hour. The apartment they entered told a story of someone who lived alone but wasn't lonely, filled with plants that had been carefully tended and artwork that suggested an eye for beauty in everyday objects. Books were stacked on every available surface, their spines revealing interests that ranged from contemporary fiction to travel photography, while the kitchen showed evidence of someone who enjoyed cooking for pleasure rather than necessity. James found her in the bathroom, unconscious on the tile floor with her breathing shallow but steady, her pulse weak but detectable when he pressed his fingers against her wrist. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair that had fallen across her face and skin that had taken on the pallor that often accompanied medical emergencies involving medication or substance interactions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As he and Marcus worked through their standard protocols, checking vital signs and preparing to transport her to the nearest hospital, James couldn't shake the feeling that something about this particular call was different. There was something familiar about the woman's features, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have encountered her before. Her face had a quality that reminded him of someone important, though the memory remained frustratingly just beyond his ability to grasp. It wasn't until they were loading her onto the stretcher and James began preparing an IV line that he rolled back the sleeve of her oversized sweater and saw the tattoo that would change everything he thought he understood about coincidence, fate, and the mysterious ways that life sometimes circles back on itself when people least expect divine intervention. The hummingbird tattoo was impossibly precise in its details, from the delicate curve of its tiny beak to the intricate feather patterns that seemed to shimmer under the ambulance's fluorescent lighting. James felt his hands freeze mid-motion as he stared at the artwork that decorated Emma Rodriguez's shoulder, his medical training warring with the emotional shock that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function professionally. The design was identical to the tattoo his wife Sarah had gotten during their second anniversary weekend in San Antonio, a spontaneous decision made after too much wine and too many conversations about the fragility of life and the importance of marking beautiful moments before they disappeared forever. Sarah had chosen the hummingbird because of a story her grandmother used to tell about souls that moved too quickly through life to be contained by ordinary circumstances, creatures that existed between worlds and carried messages between the living and the dead. She'd had it inked on her left shoulder during a weekend when they'd been deliriously happy, convinced that their love could overcome any obstacle the universe might place in their path. James had traced the outline of that tattoo with his fingertips countless times during the 2 years that followed, memorizing every curve and shadow until it became as familiar to him as his own reflection. Marcus noticed his partner's sudden stillness and moved to take over the IV preparation, assuming that fatigue was finally catching up with James after their demanding 12-hour shift. The ambulance continued its journey towards St. David's Medical Center while James struggled to process what he was seeing, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from incredible coincidence to something far more significant than random chance. The tattoo artist who had created Sarah's design had claimed it was an original piece, inspired by photographs of Central American hummingbirds that migrated through Texas each spring, but seeing an identical version on a stranger's body suggested either remarkable artistic consistency or a connection that defied easy explanation. During the 10-minute ride to the hospital, James found himself studying Emma's face for similarities that might explain the growing sense of recognition that had been nagging at him since they'd first encountered her unconscious form. Her bone structure carried echoes of Sarah's elegant features, particularly around the eyes and the curve of her jaw, though her hair was darker and her complexion suggested more time spent in direct sunlight than his wife had ever enjoyed. There was something about the way her eyebrows arched, even in unconsciousness, that reminded him of expressions Sarah used to make when she was concentrating on difficult problems or lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. The emergency room staff took over Emma's care with the efficient professionalism that James had come to respect during his years working alongside hospital personnel throughout Austin's medical community. He provided his report to the attending physician, detailing the circumstances of their response and the vital signs they'd monitored during transport, but found himself lingering longer than usual in the corridor outside her treatment room. Something about this particular case felt unfinished in ways that had nothing to do with medical protocols or professional responsibilities. Marcus eventually had to remind him that their shift was ending and paperwork needed to be completed before they could head home to their respective families and personal obligations. James signed off on the required documentation with unusual reluctance, his thoughts still occupied by the mystery of the identical tattoo and the nagging sense that Emma Rodriguez represented more than just another emergency call in a career filled with human drama and medical crises. The drive home to his East Austin neighborhood gave James time to process the evening's events, while navigating familiar streets that led to the modest 2-bedroom house he'd shared with Sarah during their marriage, and now occupied with their 8-year-old daughter, Lily. The mortgage payments were manageable on a paramedic salary, though just barely, and the neighborhood had been gradually improving over the years, as young professionals discovered its proximity to downtown and relatively affordable housing options. Lily was asleep when he arrived home, her babysitter Mrs. Chen from next door having left a note about homework completed and dinner eaten without the usual negotiations that characterized their evening routine. James stood in his daughter's doorway for several minutes, watching her peaceful expression and thinking about how much she resembled Sarah in moments of complete relaxation. The loss of her mother 2 years earlier had aged Lily in ways that broke James's heart, forcing her to develop emotional maturity that most children her age never needed to access. Sarah's death from ovarian cancer had been swift and merciless, diagnosed in late stages that offered few treatment options and even fewer reasons for hope. The disease had progressed with devastating efficiency, transforming a vibrant woman who taught elementary school and volunteered at animal shelters into someone who spent her final months fighting battles that no one should have to face before their 30th birthday. James had taken leave from his paramedic duties during her final weeks, determined to be present for every moment they had remaining together, but even now he wondered if he'd done enough to ease her pain or provide the comfort she deserved. The financial strain of medical bills and funeral expenses had forced James to return to work sooner than he would have preferred, leaving Lily in the care of babysitters and relatives, while he resumed responding to emergencies throughout Austin's sprawling metropolitan area. His salary as a paramedic covered their basic expenses, but left little room for the kind of activities and experiences that might help his daughter process her grief in healthy ways. They had attended a few sessions with a counselor who specialized in childhood bereavement, but the cost of ongoing therapy had proven prohibitive on a single parent's budget. Sleep eluded James that night as he replayed the image of Emma's tattoo and tried to make sense of the coincidence that had brought her into his ambulance. He'd never been particularly religious or spiritual, preferring to focus on the practical realities of emergency medicine and single parenthood, but something about the evening's events felt like more than random chance. Sarah had often talked about signs and connections that existed beyond ordinary perception, influenced by her grandmother's stories about souls that found ways to communicate across the boundaries between life and death. The next morning brought routine responsibilities that temporarily distracted James from his preoccupation with the mysterious patient. Lily needed breakfast and help finding her science project materials. The morning news provided updates on traffic conditions that would affect his commute to the fire station, and his phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues comparing notes about their previous shift's calls. Normal life reasserted itself with the persistence that characterized single parenthood, demanding attention to immediate concerns that left little energy for philosophical speculation about cosmic coincidences or meaningful encounters. But as James drove Lily to school and listened to her chatter about upcoming field trips and playground politics, he found his thoughts drifting back to Emma Rodriguez and the questions that her appearance in his life had raised. Who was she? How had she come to have a tattoo identical to his deceased wife's? And why did her face carry echoes of Sarah's features that seemed too pronounced to be explained by coincidence alone? The answers to those questions would have to wait until his next shift, when professional obligations might provide an excuse to check on Emma's condition and perhaps solve the mystery that was already beginning to reshape his understanding of fate, family, and the possibility that some connections transcended the boundaries of life and death in ways he'd never imagined possible. 3 days passed before James found an opportunity to return to St. David's Medical Center during his off-duty hours, ostensibly to drop off some paperwork that could have easily been handled through official channels. His curiosity about Emma Rodriguez had grown into something approaching obsession, though he told himself that his interest was purely professional concern for a patient whose case had presented unusual circumstances. The truth was more complicated than he was willing to admit, even to himself. The nursing staff in the emergency department knew James well enough to provide updates on patients he'd transported, understanding that paramedics often developed personal investment in the outcomes of their more challenging calls. Emma had been moved to a regular room on the 3rd floor after her condition stabilized, the attending physician having determined that her unconsciousness had resulted from an adverse reaction to prescription medication combined with alcohol, rather than any intentional overdose attempt. James found her room number through casual conversation with a nurse who'd worked Emma's case, then spent 10 minutes in the hospital cafeteria debating whether his visit was appropriate or whether he was crossing professional boundaries that existed for good reasons. The ethical guidelines governing paramedic conduct didn't explicitly prohibit checking on former patients, but they also didn't encourage the kind of personal interest that was driving his desire to see Emma again and ask questions that had nothing to do with her medical condition. When he finally approached room 314, James discovered Emma sitting up in bed with her laptop open, apparently working on something that required intense concentration despite her recent medical emergency. She looked healthier than she had during their ambulance ride, her color having returned to normal, and her movements suggesting that whatever had caused her collapse was no longer affecting her cognitive function. The afternoon sunlight streaming through her window revealed details about her appearance that the emergency lighting had obscured, particularly the way her facial features echoed Sarah's bone structure in ways that seemed too pronounced for coincidence. Emma looked up as James knocked gently on her doorframe, her expression shifting from mild annoyance at being interrupted to curiosity when she recognized him as one of the paramedics who had responded to her emergency. She closed her laptop and gestured for him to enter, though her body language suggested wariness about his unexpected visit. Hospital patients often felt vulnerable when approached by medical personnel during their recovery, especially when those interactions occurred outside normal treatment protocols. James introduced himself properly and explained that he'd wanted to check on her condition, though he struggled to articulate the real reason for his visit without sounding unprofessional or intrusive. Emma seemed grateful for his concern, describing her embarrassment about the circumstances that had led to her hospitalization and her relief that the episode hadn't resulted in more serious consequences. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, she explained, and the combination of deadline stress, prescription pain medication for a recent dental procedure, and wine with dinner had created a dangerous interaction she hadn't anticipated. As they talked, James found himself studying Emma's mannerisms and speech patterns for similarities to Sarah's personality traits, though he was careful not to stare in ways that might make her uncomfortable. There were subtle echoes in the way she used her hands while speaking, and the particular tilt of her head when she was thinking through complex ideas, gestures that seemed hauntingly familiar, despite the fact that he'd never met her before that night in the ambulance. The conversation gradually shifted from medical topics to more personal subjects, as Emma's initial wariness gave way to genuine appreciation for James's concern about her well-being. She'd moved to Austin from San Antonio 6 months earlier, she told him, seeking a fresh start after ending a relationship that had become more obligation than partnership. Her graphic design work allowed her to maintain clients throughout Texas while building a new life in a city that offered better opportunities for creative professionals. When James mentioned that he was a single father raising an 8-year-old daughter, Emma's expression softened with sympathy that seemed to come from personal experience with loss rather than polite concern. She asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of balancing paramedic work with parental responsibilities, demonstrating an understanding of single parenthood that suggested she'd either lived through similar circumstances or had close relationships with people who had. It was during this exchange that Emma made a casual reference to her family background that caused James's heart to skip several beats. She mentioned growing up with a twin sister who had died young, describing the unique bond that existed between twins and the devastating sense of incompleteness that followed such a loss. The way she spoke about her sister's death carried the weight of grief that James recognized from his own experience with Sarah's passing, though Emma's loss had occurred during childhood rather than young adulthood. James felt his mouth go dry as he processed this information, though he managed to maintain conversational composure, while his mind raced through implications that seemed too extraordinary to be credible. Emma continued talking about her sister's love of teaching and her dream of working with children, details that aligned perfectly with Sarah's career choices and personal interests. When she mentioned that her sister had planned to move to Austin before her death, James had to excuse himself briefly to regain his emotional equilibrium. The bathroom down the hall provided a private space where James could process what he'd just learned without Emma observing his reaction. If Emma was telling the truth about having a twin sister who had died young, and if that sister had been Sarah, then the identical tattoos and facial similarities suddenly made perfect sense. But the coincidence seemed too remarkable to be believed, even allowing for the strange ways that life sometimes connected people who were meant to find each other. When James returned to Emma's room, he found her looking through photographs on her phone, apparently searching for something specific among her digital memories. She looked up as he entered and held out her device, showing him a picture that confirmed his growing suspicions in ways that left him struggling to breathe normally. The photograph showed 2 young women who were clearly identical twins, their faces bearing the same bone structure and expressions that James had been noticing in Emma's features. One of the women in the photograph was unmistakably Sarah, though she appeared younger than James had ever seen her, probably in her early 20s based on the clothing styles and image quality. She was laughing at something beyond the camera's range, her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that James remembered from their happiest moments together. The other woman was obviously Emma, her hair styled differently and her expression more serious, but clearly the same person who was now sitting in the hospital bed, showing him proof of a connection that defied rational explanation. Emma explained that the photograph had been taken during their college years, before her sister had moved away to pursue her teaching career, and before the cancer diagnosis that had ended her life at such a young age. She spoke about Sarah with the kind of love and admiration that James recognized from his own feelings about his deceased wife, describing personality traits and dreams that matched perfectly with the woman he'd married and lost. As the conversation continued, Emma revealed details about Sarah's life that James had never known, stories from their childhood and adolescence that provided context for the woman his wife had become. She described Sarah's decision to pursue elementary education, her love of animals and volunteer work, and her romantic nature that led her to believe in soulmates, and cosmic connections between people who were destined to find each other across time and distance. The afternoon dissolved into evening, as James and Emma shared memories of the same person from completely different perspectives, their conversation creating a bridge between past and present that neither had anticipated when this unexpected reunion began. Emma's stories filled gaps in James's understanding of Sarah's background, while his descriptions of their marriage and Lily's birth provided Emma with knowledge about her sister's final years that she'd missed due to family estrangement and geographical distance. By the time visiting hours ended, both James and Emma understood that their meeting represented more than medical coincidence or random chance. They were connected through Sarah's memory in ways that created obligations and opportunities that neither felt prepared to navigate, but both recognized as too significant to ignore. Emma would be discharged the following morning, and James found himself hoping that their connection would continue beyond the artificial intimacy of a hospital room conversation. As he drove home to relieve Mrs. Chen and spend the evening with Lily, James wrestled with questions about how to explain this extraordinary development to his daughter, and whether Emma's presence in their lives represented healing or simply a different kind of loss. Sarah had often talked about the possibility that love could transcend death, but James had never imagined that such transcendence might arrive in the form of a twin sister who carried his wife's face and memories into a future that suddenly seemed filled with unexpected possibilities. The decision to introduce Emma to Lily came 3 weeks after their hospital encounter, though James had wrestled with the timing and approach throughout countless sleepless nights. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the woman sitting across from you carries the face of her deceased mother, that genetics and circumstance have conspired to bring someone into their lives who represents both profound comfort and potential confusion? James had consulted Lily's school counselor, read articles about childhood grief and healing, and even called his sister in Dallas for advice, but ultimately decided that honesty would serve his daughter better than any carefully crafted explanation designed to minimize emotional impact. They met at Zilker Park on a Saturday afternoon when Austin's spring weather had reached that perfect balance between winter's chill and summer's oppressive heat. James had suggested a public setting for their first meeting, thinking that the playground environment might provide natural distractions if the encounter became overwhelming for any of them. Emma arrived carrying a small gift bag and wearing casual clothes that made her look younger and more approachable than she had appeared in the hospital setting. Lily had been unusually quiet during the car ride to the park, asking questions about Emma that James answered with careful honesty, while avoiding details that might create unrealistic expectations about their relationship. He'd explained that Emma was someone special who had known her mother before Lily was born, a connection that made her important to their family in ways that were difficult to understand but easy to feel. The moment when Lily first saw Emma walking across the grass toward their picnic table became one of those crystalline instances that James knew he would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. His daughter's expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and something approaching wonder as she processed the sight of a woman who looked so much like the mother she remembered from photographs and fading memories. Emma knelt down to Lily's eye level and introduced herself with a kind of gentle directness that children appreciated, acknowledging the obvious without making it the center of their interaction. She presented Lily with a handmade sketchbook filled with blank pages, and explained that she was an artist who believed that drawing was one of the best ways to capture feelings that were too big for words. The gift was perfectly chosen, appealing to Lily's creative interests while providing an activity that could fill potentially awkward silences. As the afternoon progressed, James watched his daughter and Emma discover natural compatibility that seemed to transcend their unusual circumstances. Emma possessed an intuitive understanding of how to interact with children, asking questions that encouraged Lily to share her thoughts and experiences without feeling pressured to perform or impress. She listened to stories about school projects and playground friendships with genuine interest, responding with observations that demonstrated she was taking Lily seriously as an individual, rather than simply being polite to a child. The breakthrough moment came when Lily asked Emma directly about her resemblance to her mother, a question delivered with the kind of straightforward curiosity that adults often found disconcerting but that Emma handled with remarkable grace. She explained about being Sarah's twin sister, using language that Lily could understand while acknowledging the complexity of their situation without overwhelming her with adult emotions or expectations. Emma shared stories about Sarah's childhood that painted a picture of a girl who had always dreamed of becoming a teacher and helping children learn about the world around them. She described how Sarah had practiced teaching lessons with her dolls and stuffed animals, creating elaborate classroom scenarios in their shared bedroom and insisting that Emma play the role of difficult student who needed extra patience and attention. The stories were revelations for James, filling gaps in his understanding of Sarah's personality and providing context for traits he'd observed during their marriage but never fully understood. Emma's memories painted Sarah as someone who had always been nurturing and educational, whose career choice had grown from authentic passion rather than simply practical considerations about stable employment and good benefits. When Lily asked if Emma had any pictures of her mother as a child, Emma produced her phone and shared photographs that chronicled their shared childhood in San Antonio. The images showed two identical girls growing up together, their lives documented through birthday parties, school events, family vacations, and ordinary moments that had been preserved because someone understood that everyday happiness was worth remembering. Lily studied each photograph with the intensity of someone trying to memorize details that might disappear if not properly absorbed, asking questions about her mother's favorite toys, best friends, and childhood dreams. Emma answered each inquiry with patience and enthusiasm, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share memories that she'd carried alone since Sarah's death. The conversation gradually shifted to more recent topics, as Lily's initial shyness gave way to genuine engagement with someone who represented a direct connection to her mother's history. Emma asked about Lily's favorite subjects in school, her friends, her hobbies, and her plans for summer vacation, treating her as an interesting person whose opinions and experiences mattered, rather than simply being polite to James's daughter. James found himself stepping back from the conversation as Emma and Lily developed their own rhythm of interaction, watching two people who had never met before discover natural affinity that seemed to have little to do with genetic similarities or shared grief. Emma's talent for connecting with children was obvious, suggesting that her sister's nurturing instincts had been distributed equally between the twins despite their different career paths. The afternoon's pivotal moment arrived when Lily asked Emma if she missed her sister every day, a question that cut through polite conversation to address the emotional reality that connected all three of them. Emma's response was honest about the pain of losing someone who had been part of her identity since birth, but also hopeful about the possibility that love could continue in new forms, even after death separated people who belonged together. She told Lily that meeting her felt like receiving a gift from Sarah, an opportunity to know the daughter that her sister had loved so completely, but that Emma had never had the chance to meet. The conversation wasn't about replacing anyone or filling empty spaces, but about expanding their understanding of family to include connections that transcended traditional relationships and biological categories. Emma's visit extended into the evening as they moved from the park to James's house for dinner, where she admired Lily's artwork covering the refrigerator and helped prepare a meal that turned into an impromptu celebration of new friendship. The domestic scene felt natural despite its extraordinary circumstances. Three people who had been brought together by tragedy and coincidence, discovering that they enjoyed each other's company in ways that had nothing to do with their shared connection to Sarah's memory. When Emma finally prepared to leave, Lily surprised both adults by asking when she could see her again, not from politeness or obligation, but from genuine desire to continue a relationship that had exceeded everyone's expectations. Emma promised to call soon, and suggested that they might explore some of Austin's art museums together, an idea that sparked Lily's enthusiasm and provided a concrete plan for future interaction. As James walked Emma to her car, they both acknowledged that the afternoon had gone better than either had dared hope, that Lily's resilience and openness had transformed what could have been an awkward encounter into the foundation for something meaningful and healing. Emma thanked James for trusting her with his daughter's well-being, understanding that single parents had to be protective of their children's emotional stability in ways that created natural barriers to new relationships. The evening after Emma's departure, James found Lily drawing in her new sketchbook, creating detailed pictures of the three of them at the park surrounded by sunshine and trees and birds that looked suspiciously like hummingbirds. When he asked about her artwork, Lily explained that she was making pictures to help her remember the day she met her mother's sister, images that would preserve feelings that were too important to trust to memory alone. That night, as James tucked his daughter into bed, Lily asked if Emma would become part of their family now, a question that James couldn't answer definitively, but that felt like a possibility worth exploring. The future suddenly seemed filled with potential for healing and connection that he'd never imagined possible, proof that love could indeed transcend death when the right circumstances brought the right people together at exactly the right moment. 6 months later, James stood in the kitchen of a house that no longer felt like a shrine to the past but had transformed into a home where memories of Sarah coexisted peacefully with the reality of moving forward. Emma had become a regular presence in their lives, not as a replacement for what they'd lost, but as someone who helped them understand that love multiplies rather than divides when the right people find each other at the right time. The changes had been gradual but profound. Emma's graphic design expertise had led to a partnership with James's fire department, creating educational materials for community safety programs that combined her artistic skills with his practical knowledge of emergency response. The collaboration had evolved into something larger than either had anticipated, a nonprofit initiative that brought emergency preparedness education to Austin's underserved communities through visually engaging materials that made complex information accessible to families, regardless of their educational background or primary language. Lily had blossomed under Emma's influence, discovering artistic talents that had been dormant during the difficult period following her mother's death. Emma's patient instruction and encouragement had unlocked creativity that expressed itself through drawings, paintings, and mixed media projects that filled their home with color and imagination. More importantly, Lily had learned to talk about her mother with joy rather than just sadness, understanding that Sarah's love continued to exist in the stories Emma shared and the genetic traits they obviously shared. The three of them had developed traditions that honored Sarah's memory while creating new experiences that belonged uniquely to their reconstituted family. Sunday morning pancake breakfasts featured recipes that Emma remembered from their childhood, while evening art sessions in the living room provided opportunities for creative expression and quiet conversation about everything from school challenges to future dreams. Emma had moved closer to their neighborhood, finding a small studio apartment that allowed her to maintain her independence while being available for impromptu dinners, homework help, and the kind of casual family interactions that had been missing from their lives since Sarah's death. Her presence had relieved some of the pressure James felt as a single parent, providing Lily with a female role model who understood both the challenges of growing up without a mother and the importance of maintaining connection to Sarah's legacy. The community impact of their partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations. Their emergency preparedness workshops had reached hundreds of families throughout Austin, teaching practical skills while building relationships between first responders and the communities they served. Emma's visual materials had been adopted by other departments across Texas, creating a model for public education that emphasized accessibility and cultural sensitivity. James had discovered that sharing his professional knowledge in educational settings provided a different kind of satisfaction than emergency response, though he continued working as a paramedic because he couldn't imagine abandoning the work that had defined his adult identity. The combination of frontline medical service and community education felt like a calling that honored both his commitment to helping people in crisis and his desire to prevent emergencies through better preparation and awareness. The most significant transformation had occurred in James's understanding of what family could look like when circumstances required creativity and openness to unexpected possibilities. Emma wasn't Lily's stepmother or his romantic partner, but she occupied a space in their lives that defied conventional categories while serving essential emotional and practical functions that benefited everyone involved. Their relationship had evolved into something that friends and colleagues struggled to categorize, but that felt natural and necessary to the three people living it. Emma provided Lily with access to her mother's history and personality traits, while James offered Emma the opportunity to know the daughter that Sarah had loved but that she'd never had the chance to meet. Together, they'd created a support system that honored the past while embracing an uncertain but hopeful future. The one-year anniversary of Emma's emergency call became a date they marked not with sadness, but with gratitude for the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. They celebrated at the same park where they'd first met as a family, this time with a picnic that included friends from work, neighbors who'd become extended family, and children from Lily's class who'd grown accustomed to having Emma attend school events and birthday parties as an honorary aunt. James reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that night when he'd rolled back a patient's sleeve and discovered a tattoo that would challenge everything he thought he understood about coincidence, destiny, and the persistence of love beyond death. The paramedic who had responded to that emergency call had been a man focused on survival, doing whatever was necessary to provide for his daughter while managing his own grief. The person he'd become was someone who understood that healing often arrived in unexpected forms, and that the courage to remain open to possibility could transform tragedy into triumph. Emma's presence in their lives had taught them that family could expand to include people who shared love for the same person, even when that person was no longer alive to facilitate the connection. Sarah's death had seemed like an ending, but her twin sister's arrival had revealed it to be a transition that made new forms of love and support possible when the right people were brave enough to trust in outcomes they couldn't predict or control. As the sun set over Austin's skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded James of Sarah's favorite colors, he watched Lily and Emma work together on a mural that would be displayed at the next community safety fair. Their collaboration was natural and joyful. Two artists separated by 20 years, but united by shared DNA and complementary talents that created something beautiful when combined with patience and mutual respect. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with ordinary moments and extraordinary possibilities, proof that love never truly dies, but sometimes transforms into new relationships that serve the same essential purposes while honoring the memory of what came before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.